after 9 years, Inside Out is finally back. And here we tell you the most fascinating facts, secrets, and trivia about the movie. Wait, am I forgetting something? Are my sources reliable? What if people get bored with my video and hate me? Oh no, I'm starting to feel anxious. Let's just dive in right away, shall we?
Ya llegamos.
Y esto es
Al Preli.
After the overwhelming success of Inside Out at the box office, in awards, and with the public's acclaim, it was inevitable that Pixar would want to create a sequel. According to an article by Deadline, Pete Docter, the film's creator and director, wasn't very keen on the idea initially, as he was more committed to developing original projects. However, in 2016, Pixar and Docter seriously reconsidered making a sequel because hunger is relentless.
On the other hand, we have Kelsey Mann, a veteran in the animation industry. He started his career working in television at Cartoon Network, and later on he joined Pixar, where he worked as the story supervisor for Monsters University, The Good Dinosaur, and Onward.
Around 2019, as Kelsey was wrapping up his work on Onward, Docter approached him and asked if he would be interested in directing the sequel to Inside Out. Interestingly, Kelsey has been following in Docter's footsteps, so to speak. Both of them grew up in Minnesota. Docter directed and wrote Monsters Inc., while Kelsey worked on the story for Monsters University. Now, he gets to work in Inside Out 2, another sequel to one of Docter's films.
Kelsey accepted right away, but Docter didn't have a clear idea for the sequel's storyline, so the first thing they did was rewatch the movie, which ends with the following question.
Things couldn't be better. After all, Riley's 12 now. What could happen?
Well, Kelsey wanted the sequel to answer that question. They knew they had to show Riley going through puberty and all the changes that come with it.
In an interview with iFrame, Kelsey explains that he throughoutly pondered what makes a good sequel. He made two lists, one of sequels he liked and one of those he did not. He realized that a good sequel doesn't try to imitate the original. Instead, it introduces new ideas and expands its universe.
Therefore, he decided to approach Inside Out 2 as an original work rather than a sequel. Drawing inspiration from his personal experiences, he reflected on how he felt as a teenager. Looking through old photos, he noticed that at the age of 8, he was super happy, but as the years went by, his smile faded. By 13, he looked completely miserable. At that age, he only saw his flaws, doubted himself, and felt unworthy of love.
Kelsey wanted this movie to be one that would have helped him as a teenager. He created it with his teenage self in mind, to tell him that he's not the only one who is harsh on himself, that he's not alone, we all go through this, and that everything will be okay.
For the sequel, Kelsey drew inspiration from Pete Docter's original concept for the first film, which used to include even more emotions. Initially, experts told Docter that there were between 5 and 27 emotions, but he simplified to just 5 for the sake of the story. Now, several years later, Kelsey wanted to revisit and explore some of those discarded emotions. Thus, Kelsey created a list of about 20 different emotions to determine which one would be the new star of the film. He was naturally drawn to anxiety, as it was an emotion he related to both as a teenager and now as an adult.
Additionally, Kelsey sought advice from the expert psychologist Lisa Damour, an expert in teenage girls, and Dasher Keltner, a psychology professor who also gave his advice for the first film. They told him that the most prominent emotions during adolescence are those that make you self-conscious. You start worrying about what other people think and comparing yourself to others.
In his research, Kelsey also found out that anxiety was increasing among teenagers. This was in 2019. Then the pandemic hit and everything got worse. Anxiety skyrocketed not only among teenagers but across all ages. Consequently, it became clear that anxiety would be the focus of the sequel.
Anxiety is an emotion that is there to protect us. It prepares us for potential problems that might happen in the future. However, it is very good at its job, sometimes too good, which is why it is important to learn how to manage it in a healthy way.
In an interview, Kelsey was asked why joy is the only positive emotion. However, Kelsey replied that, for him, all emotions are positive because they all care and protect you. That said, it is indeed true that joy is the only pleasant emotion, while the others tend to be unpleasant.
Emotion scientist Dasher Keltner, who provided expert advice to Pixar, always insisted on including more pro-social emotions, which are those that motivate us to act beneficially towards others. He specifically suggested adding compassion and awe. However, Pixar seems to select emotion based on how much conflict they can create for Riley in the story, which might explain why joy is the only pleasant emotion in the group. But this is just a speculation.
Nevertheless, Kelsey ended up selecting selecting 9 emotions for the film. These were Schadenfreude, the pleasure of seeing others suffer, guilt, shame, jealousy, envy, embarrassment, ennui, and anxiety. However, this turned out to be too overwhelming, so they decided to simplify it to the 4 new emotions we see in the film. Kelsey has said that when you are a teenager, it feels like new emotions come in and suddenly take over, so he came up with the idea that the story of this sequel would be just that, new emotions literally taking over the headquarters.
Once the premise was established, it was time for the team to come together. Kelsey Mann was the director, Meg LaFoupe, who was a writer in the original film, came back to write the sequel alongside Dave Holstein, and Marissa Horowitz served as the film's editor.
Andrea Datzman composed the score for the film, making this the first Pixar movie to have a female composer. She has worked extensively at Pixar on films like Ratatouille, Up, Cars 2, and Inside Out. Interestingly, she's also the voice behind the catchy Triple Den Gum jingle that Riley can't seem to forget.
Yes, again!
By the way, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so that Alfie won't have anxiety. The emotions in Inside Out are based on simple shapes. Joy is a star, sadness is a teardrop, anger is a square, and so on. This approach was also used for the new emotions. For example, anxiety is an orange lightning bolt, ennui is a bent stick, shame is a large circle, and envy is shaped like a pushpin.
An interesting detail regarding the character designs is that in the first film, the male emotions, anger and fear, had more exaggerated designs, whereas the female emotions, joy, sadness and disgust, had more realistic proportions. This was something the crew aimed to correct in the sequel. That's why anxiety, envy and ennui also have exaggerated designs.
Among the initial ideas for Anxiety's design, she was presented as a Godzilla-like monster. The concept was that the more you fight it, the bigger and stronger it gets. But if you learn to manage it, it shrinks.
Another idea they had was to introduce anxiety as a character named TIA, which stood for Transitional Integration Advisor. Later on, it would be revealed that TIA was actually anxiety in disguise. However, this concept was abandoned as they deemed the plot twist unnecessary.
To depict the intensity that anxiety can provoke, the designers gave it a slim body, similar to a lightning bolt, which contrasts dramatically with its expressive eyes and mouth. Moreover, its hair adds an explosive feel to its design. Also, since this emotion is related to fear, they wanted to incorporate in anxiety's design the same large eyes and floating eyebrows as fear.
There were numerous iterations of envy because, being a negative emotion, it proved challenging to create a likable character. Therefore, they decided to make her more charming by portraying her as someone who only sees the best in others. Also, there's a lot of emphasis in her eyes, as the word envy comes from the Latin verb invidere, which means to look in a hostile manner.
Originally, Embarrassment was going to be a woman with glasses, braces, and curly hair. In fact, she reminds me a lot of Chucky Finster from Rugrats. Judging by the early drawings, it seemed that she was intended to be clumsy, sweaty, prone to splitting when she talked, and frequently dropping things. However, this particular design was ultimately discarded in favor to the one we saw in the movie.
Ennui emerged from the effort to find an emotion that captured the tendency of teenagers to oppose adults. Originally, they tried with indignation and contempt, but contempt turned out to be too toxic and hard to characterize. Ultimately, they settled on ennui, aiming to showcase a lesser-known emotion. Ennui was ideal because it raises questions in the audience and makes them realize that there are more complex emotions than they might initially think.
Ennui is a French word, which is why the character is French and is voiced by French actress Adele Exarchopoulos, or as Joy would say, Adele Oui Oui. She also voiced Ennui in the French version of the film. To reflect her apathy, they made her uninterested in standing straight, giving her a slouching posture. Ennui's design consists of curves except for her nose, which contours and balances her design.
For the sequel, the core memories and the islands of personality were set aside to focus on a more complex concept, the sense of self. This comprises the collection of beliefs Riley has about the life and herself. However, as you can imagine, it was quite challenging for Pixar to visualize such an abstract and complex concept.
According to the art book, the creative team spent a lot of time debating about how the sense of self should show, what it is, how it changes, and if it can be damaged or manipulated. It needed to feel integrated into Riley's mental world while clearly showing how Riley perceives herself. At one stage, they contemplated making the sense of self a small version of Riley, like an inner self, but eventually they chose to depict it with abstract figures.
Another important concept introduced in this sequel is the stream of consciousness, which shows what Riley is thinking at any given moment. To design this river, they decided to make it colorful and bright, drawing inspiration from long exposure photographs of bioluminescent algae and LED lights dragged around to create linear glowing patterns. Initially, the stream of consciousness was intended to have a more prominent role in the film, but we'll explain this in more detail in another video.
Some members of the original cast did not return for this sequel, notably Bill Hader and Mindy Kaling, who portrayed Fear and Disgust respectively. According to Vulture, this was because the other emotions were offered only 2% of what was paid to Amy Poehler, the actress behind Joy. She received a salary of $5 million plus a substantial bonus, while the rest of the cast was offered only $100,000 without any bonuses.
To choose the voice actors, Kelsey saw talent that could perfectly embody the characters they were wielding. Doctor also advised him to pay attention to the actors' personalities and behavior when they were not acting. This approach was meant to find individuals who naturally embody the traits of the characters, with the intention of making the acting more authentic.
Pixar approached Maya Hawke to see if she was interested in voicing Anxiety for their new movie. However, she was only available during the time when director Kelsey Mann would be on vacation with his family at Walt Disney World. So, while he was at the park, they took him to a back office and the audition was conducted via Zoom call.
Despite the unusual circumstances of the audition, Hawke's performance moved Kelsey to tears, and he hired her on the spot. Hawke's great energy and quick speech made her a strong candidate. However, what really secured her the role was her ability to bring the humanity needed for the character, making Anxiety feel like she genuinely wanted the best for Riley.
Fear and Disgust weren't the only ones to be recast. Riley also needed a new actress. Caitlin Diaz, who originally voiced Riley, was 11 years old at the time. Well, that was 9 years ago. Now she's 20. And Pixar was looking for someone closer in age to Riley. They found Kensington Tallman, a teenager with a voice very similar to that of Caitlin's.
Inside Out 2 faced two major challenges. First, production began during the pandemic, forcing the artists to work from home. But their second challenge was even bigger, as the 2023 actors' strike threatened to delay the project. With the imminent strike, the crew's anxiety skyrocketed and they worked tirelessly with the actors to complete 30 recording sessions in just 30 days.
Fortunately, all that recorded material was enough for the animators to work with during the nearly 4 months the strike lasted. After the strike ended, the team conducted another 30 recording sessions in 1 month. Without these recording sessions, the movie would certainly have been delayed.
Perhaps the most peculiar of these sessions were those with Paul Walter Hauser, who voices Embarrassment. Since his character doesn't speak, his sessions consisted entirely of vocalizations. The director instructed Paul to communicate only through sounds what the character would say if he had the courage to speak, resulting in one of the most unusual recording sessions.
We'll stop here for today's video. Remember to like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell to stay tuned for the next part. Also, if you like this video, please watch this other video of ours that we think you like. We love you. Bye!